The summer I turned 9, my parents started leaving a spare key under a loose brick by the porch. That way, I could let myself into a stranger's kitchen 3 doors down from our house. Nothing about the setup was sentimental. It was just 2 tired adults working overlapping shifts, trying to keep their kids safe. Funny thing is that half-practical routine ended up carving out a bigger space in my life than almost anything else that came after. I'm Tasha Reynolds. I'm 31 now, and I want to tell this story the way it really started, quietly, at the edges of everyday life. No drama at first, because the drama didn't show up until much later, and when it did, I never saw it coming. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. Back then, my parents, Donna and Marcus, worked crazy long hours. Mom was at a distribution center an hour outside town. Dad handled county maintenance, roads, pipes, whatever needed fixing. Most days their shifts overlapped just enough that I'd get off the bus and find our house empty. For a while, I just let myself inside and did my homework alone. My mom hated that. Not because anything bad happened, but because the idea of her kids sitting alone gnawed at her every shift. So she asked Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a widow with a neat brick house and a garden she kept even neater, if I could sit at her kitchen table after school until someone came home. Eleanor said yes, just like that, and for nearly 2 decades, 3 doors down stopped being a neighbor's address. It became a second home. When you're a kid, you don't realize how rare that is. You just assume everyone has it. Eleanor wasn't some soft-hearted grandmother figure, though. If I offered an opinion carelessly, she made me defend it. She corrected my grammar right away, no sugar. She'd been a court reporter for 35 years, listening to divorce fights, contract disputes, criminal trials, every kind of human chaos. All that experience gave her a sharpness she brought into every conversation we had. She once told me, maybe when I was 12, that the worst mistake a person can make is confusing their own feelings with facts. I didn't get it then. Much later, I watched people wreck their lives by doing exactly that. My parents were grateful, in their own way. They sent Eleanor a card every Christmas, dropped off casseroles, spoke about her warmly at family events, the kind old widow looking after their girl. If you're not paying attention, all that gratitude sounds simple, almost shallow. But underneath, the connection was deeper, messier, real. I think about how strange it is, looking back, that nobody in my family ever actually asked what Eleanor and I talked about all those afternoons. They assumed homework, snacks, basic supervision. They never knew she taught me how to read a contract before I ever signed one as an adult, or that she walked me through, slowly and patiently, how a courtroom actually decides who's telling the truth, which turned out to matter a great deal more than I ever expected it to. By high school, I was driving Eleanor to her doctor appointments. She trusted me more than the senior center van. Later, when I was 23 and out of college, Eleanor got breast cancer. It was me sitting beside her through 11 rounds of chemo, clutching a paperback I never actually read, mostly watching the IV drip. When her hands started shaking too much for insulin shots, I learned to do them myself. Most mornings I'd sit on the edge of her bed with the newspaper, trading sections back and forth while we waited to make sure her blood sugar had stabilized before I left for work. My parents knew all this in a vague, background way, the sort of knowledge you have about things you've decided aren't your responsibility. They never came to a single appointment. They never learned the insulin routine, not even on the weeks I had a double shift and couldn't get there until late. Still, somehow, the story they told everyone was that they had been there for Eleanor, that they had carried her through her old age. That version was so far from what actually happened that for a long time I didn't even try correcting it. It just took too much energy, and it always felt smaller than the relationship itself to argue about who got credit for it. There was one real thing my parents did for Eleanor, and I need to lay it out honestly, because it's the seed of everything that happened afterward. When I was 16, my family almost lost our house. My dad got hurt, lost his job for a while, and the bank was 3 payments from starting foreclosure. Eleanor, who'd known us 7 years by then, co-signed a loan for $40,000 to get my parents caught up. She did it quietly, the way she did most things, without making anyone feel small for needing it. My parents paid that loan back in full over 6 years. I want that stated clearly, because it matters enormously to everything that came later. The debt was repaid, on time, documented, finished. But somewhere after that final payment cleared, the story my parents told about it started to drift. Gratitude calcified into something else entirely. What we did for Eleanor became a phrase that came up at church, on the phone with my aunts, at family dinners, a phrase that implied an ongoing debt rather than a closed one. Over the years, that idea hardened into something my parents genuinely, sincerely believed, that they had been like family to a woman with no children and no remaining relatives of her own, that they had carried her through her last decade alone, and that whatever she eventually left behind was somehow owed back to them in some final accounting, a debt of feelings settled in cash. I don't think they were lying when they said these things. I think they told the story so many times, in so many comfortable rooms, that the retelling eventually replaced the actual memory, the way a worn path through a field slowly becomes the only path anyone remembers, even after the original ground underneath it is long gone. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in October, in her sleep, at 83, exactly the way she always told me she hoped to go. I found her the next morning when she didn't answer the door for our usual coffee. I won't describe that morning. It belongs to me, not to this story. Grief showed up later, smaller and quieter than I expected, mostly late at night, mostly when I reached for my phone to call her about something ordinary before remembering, all over again, that I couldn't. The will was read a few weeks later through her estate attorney, Mr. Castellano, a careful, unhurried man who, it turned out, had known Eleanor far longer and far better than I'd realized. Her estate was modest by any extravagant standard. A paid-off house, a retirement account she'd built slowly over 35 years of steady court reporter wages, some careful investments. Altogether, just under $400,000. She left almost all of it to me. I want to be honest about how that felt before any of what came next happened. It felt heavy, not lucky, not like a windfall. It felt like the weight of being truly chosen by someone who had actually seen me for years in a way almost nobody else in my life ever had, and I sat in that office holding the paperwork and cried harder than I had since the morning I found her, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to the specific ache of being loved that thoroughly by someone who was no longer there to thank for it. My parents' reaction came fast, and it didn't start as anger. It started, the way most things in my family start, as a calm, almost gentle conversation at the kitchen table. My mother's voice soft, a little apologetic, explaining that of course she was happy Eleanor had thought of me, but surely I understood, given everything the family had done for that woman over the years, the loan, the casseroles, the cards, every single Christmas, that some of what Eleanor left behind really ought to come back to the family as a whole, instead of sitting entirely with one person. I told her, as calmly as I could, that the loan had been repaid in full years earlier, that it wasn't an ongoing debt, that Eleanor herself had never once suggested she owed anyone anything beyond what had already been paid back. My mother's face did something complicated when I said that, something I couldn't quite name, before she said, "Tasha, you don't understand how these things work. A loan like that, between family, it's never really just about the money." I didn't understand then how deep that belief actually ran in both my parents. The conversations got worse over the following weeks, slowly, the way most family conflicts do, not through one big explosion, but through a string of smaller ones, each slightly worse than the last. My father, usually the quiet one, started bringing it up at dinner, talking about fairness, about what was right, language that always somehow avoided saying outright what he actually wanted, which was money. My mother called my aunts, and within a month, the story had spread through the whole extended family in a version that barely resembled what had actually happened. In that version, my parents had selflessly cared for a lonely old woman for 15 years, and I had simply shown up at the end to collect what they had spent a decade earning. I tried for a while to correct it, calmly, with actual specifics. The appointments, the chemo, the insulin, who had actually shown up and when. It made almost no difference at all. People believe whatever story they've heard the longest, and the most consistently, no matter what actually happened. And my parents had been telling their version for 15 years while I had said almost nothing, because correcting them out loud had always felt smaller than the relationship itself. The legal letter arrived in December, 2 months after Eleanor died, from an attorney I had never heard of named Gerald Pruitt, the kind of attorney I learned later from Mr. Castellano, who specialized in exactly this sort of low-cost, high-volume estate fight. The letter announced that my parents intended to formally contest the will on the grounds of undue influence, claiming that I had used my closeness to Eleanor, my access to her, in her final vulnerable years, to manipulate a lonely, poor, isolated old woman into leaving her estate to me, instead of distributing it more broadly within a family she had supposedly considered her own for over 2 decades. I want to describe honestly what reading that letter felt like, because it was, without question, the worst part of the entire ordeal, worse even than the morning I found her. It wasn't only that the claim was false. It was that it took the realest, most carefully tended relationship of my entire life and rewrote it, in cold legal language, as a con. A long, patient manipulation by someone who had apparently been calculating the payoff the whole time. Mr. Castellano, when I called him in something close to a panic, stayed remarkably calm. He explained that undue influence claims were real and common, often used exactly in situations like mine, and that defending against one could be slow and expensive, dragging out for the better part of a year, freezing the estate the entire time, requiring depositions, requiring me to sit across from a stranger and defend every kindness I had ever shown a dying woman, as though it might have been strategy instead of love. But, he said, and there was something almost peaceful in the way he said it, Eleanor had seen this coming. Years ago. Almost word for word. The months leading up to the hearing were, without exaggeration, the hardest sustained stretch of my entire life. My parents stopped speaking to me directly, communicating instead through Pruitt's office, a formality that somehow hurt worse than open hostility would have. An old family friend I'd known since childhood was deposed and, under pressure from my mother, gave testimony suggesting Eleanor had seemed increasingly dependent on me in her final years. Testimony that was technically true and, in the context it was being used, a complete distortion of what real dependence between two people who love each other actually looks like. Thanksgiving that year happened at my aunt's house. Without me, my absence explained to relatives in vague, sympathetic terms that made clear, without ever saying so directly, that I was the one who had done something wrong. I spent a long stretch of that winter convinced I was going to lose, not because the claim was true, but because I had watched, firsthand, how thoroughly a story repeated often enough can overpower a true one, how exhausting it becomes to keep defending the realest thing in your life against people who have decided, for reasons that had very little to do with me, that it was actually a lie. What I didn't know, until the week before the hearing, was exactly how thoroughly Eleanor had prepared for this. Mr. Castellano called me into his office on a Thursday and told me he wanted to show me something before the hearing, something Eleanor had insisted on years earlier, around the time her loan had been fully repaid. It was a video, he explained, a standard but underused legal practice called a testator capacity and intent recording, used specifically to prevent exactly this kind of contest. A recorded statement made at the time a will is drafted, establishing clearly on camera that the person making the will is lucid, of sound mind, and acting entirely of their own free will and understanding. He played it for me in his office, and I want to describe what it felt like to see Eleanor again, alive, sharp, sitting in a chair I recognized from her own living room, speaking calmly into a camera years before either of us could have known how necessary that recording would eventually become. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield," she said, her voice exactly as I remembered it, unhurried and precise. "I am 81 years old, in full possession of my faculties, and I am making this recording because I have spent 35 years in courtrooms watching families destroy each other over money that was never really about money at all, and I do not intend to let that happen to the people I care about after I'm gone." She went on, methodically, the way she approached everything, naming my parents specifically, describing the loan in exact detail, the amount, the year, the repayment schedule, stating clearly that the debt had been repaid in full years before this recording was even made, and that she did not consider it, in any way, an ongoing claim on her estate or her affection. "I am leaving the majority of what I have to Tasha Reynolds," she said, "not because of any debt owed to her, but because she has spent more than a decade of her own life showing up for me in ways no loan could ever measure, ways that were never transactional, and I will not have that mischaracterized by anyone after I am no longer able to speak for myself. If my neighbors ever attempt to claim this decision was the result of manipulation rather than my own clear and considered judgment, I want whoever is watching this to understand that I anticipated exactly that possibility, and I reject it fully while I am still entirely capable of rejecting it myself." I sat in that office and cried harder than I had since the funeral. Not from sadness this time, but from something closer to relief, so total it felt almost violent. The realization that Eleanor, even from beyond the end of her own life, had reached forward in time to protect me from exactly the thing that was happening. The hearing itself, when it finally arrived, was almost anticlimactic, which Mr. Castellano had warned me, with a kind of dry satisfaction, was usually a very good sign. Pruitt made his arguments, the same vague language about vulnerability and dependence that had been circulating through my family for months. Mr. Castellano, when his turn came, simply played the recording, in full, in open court, Eleanor's voice filling a room she had never once set foot in, naming my parents specifically, closing the exact loophole they had spent 15 years building their entire emotional case around, long before they had ever filed a single piece of paperwork against me. The judge didn't seem rattled. She was calm, almost bored, like this kind of dispute was old news to her by now. After the recording wrapped, she dismissed the objection within minutes. It was almost a throwaway comment, the way she said it, pointing out how rare it was to see someone plan for trouble this carefully, naming the exact challenge outright years in advance, making it impossible to misinterpret her intentions later. She said the recording alone would have been enough to shut down the whole argument, even without the additional financial records Mr. Castellano had also submitted, the one showing the loan's full and timely repayment, every payment dated and documented. My parents didn't say a single word to me as we left the courthouse. I didn't expect them to. Walking out into the cold March afternoon, I didn't feel victorious. Nothing close to that. It was something quieter, harder to describe. Something closer to being emptied out. The specific exhaustion of finally being allowed to stop defending something that should never have needed defending in the first place. A few minutes later, Mr. Castellano caught up with me in the parking lot, and he told me something then that I have carried with me every single day since. He said Eleanor had come to his office years earlier, not long after the loan's final payment cleared, back when she was apparently the only person who remembered that the debt was already settled, and told him, with the same calm precision she brought to everything, "When my neighbor's family comes for this money someday, and they will, because I have watched 15 years of a story slowly grow teeth, I want you to make absolutely certain that nobody is ever allowed to make Tasha relive what she actually did for me as though it were a lie." I replay that sentence more than almost anything else from that entire year. Not only because it decided the case, although it did cleanly and completely, but because it showed me something I hadn't fully let myself understand until that exact moment in a cold parking lot, which is that Eleanor had known exactly what was coming, long before I did, and had spent years quietly building the only kind of armor that could actually survive it. Not anger, not even love, exactly, in the usual sense of the word. Evidence. Patient, specific, entirely true evidence. In the months that followed, I did not reconcile with my parents. Not in any meaningful sense, and I want to be honest about that. Instead of offering some softened version, where everyone eventually understands each other and gathers warmly around a table again. My mother sent one email weeks after the hearing suggesting we move past this for the sake of the family, language that still, even after everything, managed to avoid naming what had actually been done. I didn't respond for a long time, and when I finally did, it was short. I told her I was willing to have a relationship with them going forward, but not one built on the same story they had spent 15 years telling about a debt that had already been paid in full a long time before any of this ever started. I still live in my own house now, not Eleanor's, although I kept hers for a while before eventually selling it to a young family who, I'm told, have a daughter about the age I was when I first started letting myself in through that side door with the key from under the loose brick. I think Eleanor would have liked that, the practical shape of it, if not the sentiment, since sentiment was never really her language. What she gave me, in the end, wasn't only the money, though the money mattered, and helped, and changed the shape of my life in ways I'm still discovering. What she gave me was the long, specific patient proof that being truly seen by even one person, for years without an audience and without a transaction attached to it, is worth more than any story a family can talk itself into believing, no matter how many times they repeat it at the dinner table, no matter how comfortable that repetition eventually starts to feel.